Welcome to Planetary Business, the podcast that teaches you how to run your business successfully while respecting the planetary boundaries. In today's episode, we will be talking about the war in Ukraine. However, this will not be a conversation about the war against humanity and our Western values, nor about bombed infrastructure. It will be about the war against nature. What most people don't know, this war is destroying Europe's last great wilderness area. The territory of Ukraine contains habitats that are home to 70,000 plant and animal species, many of which rare, relict, and endemic, such as European bison as well as sturgeon, the world's most threatened group of species. The war hit the country after decades of exploitation and contamination of soil, air, and water. Further depletion of nature will have severe effects on Ukraine's productivity and thus on the global food system. This is why I want to dedicate this episode to the dream of, and even a plan for, a green recovery after the war. A plan to build back better, designed by WWF and the Boston Consulting Group. And you will see that the solutions will not just be the right ones for Ukraine, but for any other country. My guest today is Andreas Beckmann, an American who has been living in Eastern Europe for over 2 decades. He's the CEO of WWF in Central and Eastern Europe. Hello, Andreas. Thanks for being on my show.
Hello. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm a fan of your show.
Oh, thank you. Andreas, you're now calling in from Vienna. Which are the countries you are overseeing as CEO?
The country is trying to go from west to east: Czech Republic, Slovakia, Ukraine, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Moldova.
Wow. And this region is called the Green Heart of Europe. Why?
It is, in fact. Many people think of Central and Eastern Europe as, the poor part of the continent. I think that's misguided. It's actually Europe's treasure chest for nature. It is home to many of the continent's greatest remaining areas of wetlands, natural forests, home to more than half of the European populations of large carnivores, including bears, wolves, lynx. A lot of the relatively wild areas of the continent are found here.
We'll hear much more about that from you. And could we please start with some good news for a change?
Try.
What have you accomplished in your region which can give us some hope?
WWF has been engaged in the region since the fall of the Iron Curtain, or in fact actually before that, since the middle of the 1980s in the case of Hungary. We've played a very major role in development of nature conservation in the region since then. Just some examples. In 2000, the governments of Romania, Bulgaria, Ukraine, and Moldova signed the Lower Danube Green Corridor Agreement. Similarly, a year later, 2001, we were involved in organizing the Summit for Environment and Sustainable Development in the Carpathians. That led to the establishment of the Carpathian Convention. And these are two kind of key, let's say, agreements, milestones that we've been working to actually fulfill in a large part since then. Also, in the run-up to the EU accession of the different countries to the European Union, played an important role, especially in the implementation of Natura 2000, the nature conservation legislation, related use of EU funds. Forests led the way in the introduction of sustainable forest management principles, especially through FSC certification, have also played a very important role in protection of the old growth forests. I can go on.
What about European bison? They came back, right? Didn't they?
Yeah, European bison almost went extinct in the 1920s. I think they were down to about 50 individuals, none of them in the wild, all of them in captivity. And that has been actually one of these success stories of conservation. There are something like 6,000 European bison, and we've played a role in reintroducing them.
It's wonderful. The corporate world is finally seeing nature as an important strategic partner, thank God. The supermarket giant Tesco is collaborating with you, for instance. Could you elaborate on that? How does that work?
Yeah, I think generally worldwide there's been a real shift in corporate engagement, and that is something that we've also seen in our part of the world. The work with Tesco is focused on sustainable food, and our ambition is to reduce the ecological footprint of the average shopping basket. And so we do that through, on the one hand, engaging consumers, trying to influence their choices. The second stream of work is focused on the supply chain, the suppliers to Tesco, and working with them to improve their footprint. And then a third piece is focused on the overall rules of the game, let's say, the advocacy, the legislation. So it's exciting stuff.
Yeah, that's quite a lever that you have there. Okay, so we see there are a lot of things we can do to create an economy that works with nature and not against it. We must keep that in mind when we think about What is at stake in Ukraine? To be honest, Andreas, before I read your publications, I had absolutely no idea how valuable, how crucial Ukraine is for the global biodiversity. Could you take us on a quick journey? What makes this country so special?
Well, it's also part of the green heart of Europe, as we say. If we go from the west to the east, you have in the western part the Carpathian Mountains, some very valuable old growth forests, beech forests, natural forests there. Some of them are part of the World Heritage Site. In the north, Polesia, bordering on Belarus, also a valuable area of forests, also a very boggy area, so wetland areas as well. And then large parts of the country are more agricultural, formerly steppe ecosystems. Unfortunately, most of those areas have been lost, which is a real shame. And then wetland areas as well. In the southern part of the country, there is a part of the Danube Delta, which is also belonging to Ukraine. So it gives you a sense of the range of the different kinds of ecosystems that exist in the country.
So which animals do we have there that are so rare?
We have the large carnivores as being kind of, let's say, iconic species, the bears, lynx, the wolves. We have bison. And if we look at fish, I would say the most prominent are sturgeon, for example, beluga sturgeon. Prehistoric animals, they survived the age of the dinosaurs, fortunately now are teetering on the brink of extinction.
And can you tell us more about the Danube Delta? There's a lot of reed, right?
It's the world's largest reed bed, and so quite spectacular in that respect. Home, of course, to fish, but also a wide range of birds as well. Pelicans, Dalmatian pelicans, for example, and others, red-breasted geese.
Now, how has the war affected these ecosystems?
The war has been terrible for people, of course, for infrastructure, but also for the environment. There have been direct impacts on many areas. An estimate is about a third protected areas in the country have been affected by the war.
Affected in what way?
From actual fighting in it, fires as a result of fighting. So we had the attacks that came from Belarus into the Chernobyl area. That's a valuable area of Polesia, and there were forest fires there. And then, of course, also tanks and other military vehicles going through the areas. So that kind of direct destruction. Mining, a major problem in terms of many of these areas, but then also indirect impacts from water pollution, air pollution, as you can imagine, as these industrial sites are hit. The fighting is going on in the Donbass, which is the most heavily industrialized part of the country.
There's a lot of toxic waste stored.
Indeed, yes. Yeah.
So that is leaking into the environment.
That is leaking into the environment, into air, but also into water and onto the land as well, of course. I mean, we have indications. The war didn't start on the 24th of February. In fact, it started in 2014 with the occupation of the Donbass. And so there's been a lot of impacts already from that time that we're aware of. And that, of course, is increasing and continuing.
There's shelling of oil and gas depots, I imagine.
Yeah, I'm sure you've seen the pictures of Mariupol, absolute devastation, heavily industrialized area. Of course, that all has an impact. I should also mention, the indirect impacts as well. Let's say the fact that even protected areas in the Carpathian area, which have so far not been directly affected by the fighting, nevertheless, they've had resources drawn from them to other parts, not to mention, of course, rangers that are now involved in fighting this war. So the impacts are immense, and we will only know when the fighting actually stops what the full impact will have been.
What about air pollution? Do we have any studies that tell us how much carbon has entered the atmosphere because of the war?
As you can imagine, not only from the waste as a result of the pollution, actually from the fighting, from, for example, fuel depots being hit, creating, of course, huge amounts of emissions, down to the actual vehicles themselves. So in terms of hitting our climate change targets, not a good thing at all, of course. But actual numbers I unfortunately don't have.
What about the opportunity cost? Yeah. If we didn't have that war, what would people be doing?
I can point to one specific thing. We had planned to translocate bison from Poland, from Bielorussia, to bring them to the Chernobyl area, to the biosphere reserve there. And of course, that's been frustrated by the war. So that dream, a relatively small one, but still a prominent one, that's one of the opportunity costs. Other opportunity costs, of course, include making progress on addressing climate change in terms of developing renewable energy. There's been significant impacts on renewables, windmills, for example, solar panels in Ukraine, especially in the southern part of the country, which has got a concentration of that. The fighting has been happening there, and so that's been affected. And of course, we'll have the issue going forward of focusing resources on the war rather than addressing these kinds of really bigger challenges in the grand scheme of things. We're going backwards because of this war, and that is just heartbreaking.
We shouldn't forget that this terrible war hit a country that was having enough problems already. Last year's GDP was only 13% of the EU average, can you imagine? And the loss of nature and the impact of climate change had already become critical. What can you tell us about that? You've been around for so long.
Yeah. I mean, there was already, as in other parts of the world, so I don't want to say that Ukraine is unique in the sense, but there were some
No, unfortunately not.
significant challenges with regards to nature loss, with regards to climate change. And if you look at agriculture, it's a very industrial agriculture as practiced in the Soviet period. And also more recently, got these massive fields that have destroyed valuable steppe ecosystems, huge use of chemical inputs, pesticides, fertilizers. They have polluted rivers and waterways, killed fish populations, and so on. So those are all things that were happening already before. And that situation has just been made more difficult during the war. The impacts directly on agriculture and the question mark then going forward.
It's generally true that nature is not only important in itself, but also as the foundation of the economy. In Ukraine, this is particularly obvious, isn't it?
Yes, because agriculture is one of the most important industries in the country, both in terms of economy itself, but then especially for exports. Forestry, less important, but also significant, and also heavy industry, which has an impact on climate change, especially. So less maybe on nature, but on climate change. And so those 2, 3 industries have a major impact on environment and dependent, especially in the case of agriculture, very much dependent on the environment.
So the end of the war will not automatically lead to an end of nature loss, unfortunately. What we need is a change in the mindset of everybody involved in the post-war era. I remember there was the first Ukraine recovery conference in Lugano, yet without the necessary commitment our planet needs now.
That's correct. There was a reconstruction conference in Lugano in July. Quite, I have to say, quite remarkable in the middle of the war to also then start thinking already about reconstruction. So that was quite impressive. If you dig into the details of that, the principles are there, the commitment is there. But then when you dig into it in terms of the details, less convincing. And so that was part of the reason why we decided to put out a report pitching basically what we think should be in that. I should just say that that was a first draft from the government with the idea of a second draft coming. And so this is part of a process. I certainly wouldn't criticize the government for that.
So this is where you jump in.
Yep.
The WWF joined forces with the Boston Consulting Group to work out a roadmap to build back better. The report is called A Sustainable Economic Recovery for People and Nature, and I will link it in the show notes. What was the idea behind your collaboration?
Of course, the war is going on. None of us can say when it will actually stop, unfortunately. But at some point, sooner or later, and in some form, there will be a time for reconstruction. And at that point, while there's going to be very clearly immediate needs, humanitarian, social needs that need to be addressed, and they need to have priority. What we're trying to say with the report is basically don't lose sight of the fact that the longer term challenges that Ukraine and also the rest of the world are facing in terms of climate change and in terms of biodiversity loss, that the immediate actions we're taking need to be put into that broader context. So try on the one hand to not do significant harm to the situation, and then going forward to ensure that the investments that are made in such a way that we're moving towards decarbonization and also a more nature positive future, working with nature rather than against it, moving away from this biodiversity destruction which we currently have.
Before we hear your recommendations in detail, Andreas, I really wonder what makes you optimistic that people will listen to you and change their behavior? Why should people make sustainability the top priority now if they didn't do it in the past? That is so difficult in any country in the world, as we know.
Yeah.
And here, right after this traumatic war, isn't that too much to hope for?
That is a good question. I think we're seeing a real shift in paradigms, I guess you could call it, a new generation coming of age that has different interests.
Really?
Yes, and I see that in terms of reforms also within government. Corruption has been a major issue and will continue to be a major issue. And there's the commitment. There's so much suffering going on right now through the war that my expectation, my hope, is that a new approach will come. So that will be one thing. But I think much more maybe tangible, let's say, is the fact that Ukraine has the prospect of joining the European Union. So the EU accession process will certainly be a very powerful lever pushing in the direction of sustainability. There's some very strong commitments within EU legislation, within EU policies that will push Ukraine in this direction. Also coming from international donors and financiers, a lot of the support for reconstruction will have to come from abroad. And there is a much stronger awareness for ensuring that investment is made in something that is sustainable, that it's good investment and building back better.
You think that will be a condition?
Yes, to a significant extent. And that's part of the reason why we also wrote the report, is also to push in that direction. Maybe also worth mentioning is business as well. Worldwide, we're also already seeing that business standards and interests are changing, and it will not be possible certainly to reconstruct in an unsustainable way. Already before the war, there was pressure being felt in the agri industry, for example, for higher environmental standards because they were supplying to international companies that were concerned about their scope 3 emissions. So I think that will be a major lever in this direction.
I hope you're right. I would be very happy to see that happening. So let's go through the most important sectors of the country. What are your suggestions, your recommendations concerning agriculture?
Yeah, agricultural, all of our recommendations are, in a sense, it's like a microcosm of what would be our recommendations for the rest of the world, of course, under specific circumstances in Ukraine. I think very basically it means reducing the use of fossil fuel and chemical inputs. How do you do that? Through organic farming, for example. It's a relatively small percentage of farming in Ukraine right now is organic. So there's certainly potential to increase that there. But also, for example, through precision farming, also having more biodiversity elements in the landscapes. So in the fullest sense, working with nature rather than against it.
Ukraine has increased the use of fertilizer per hectare by 5 in the last 20 years. So you can see this is not going in the right direction. They cannot continue like that. But it's still true that if you're not that sustainable, you save a lot of money in the short run. And only in the long run will you see how important it is to have this sustainable way of doing agriculture. How do you finance that?
That's the basic challenge that we're facing worldwide, right, with our agricultural systems. That said, I wouldn't completely agree with you because the fertilizers are basically fossil fuel based. And it's very clear now, both in terms of the costs, but also where a lot of the fossil fuels are coming from, that we need to come off of that. So also in terms of the costs, there's a real pressure against using these, in fact.
Which is good.
Yeah, exactly. So there'll certainly be a premium on using them in a much more limited way, in a more precise way. That's where we get to the precision farming, for example, if we don't go for organic, for example.
Let's assume people don't change the way they treat soil and water. What will be the effects on the economy and the global food market?
As you know, Ukraine is a major producer at the global level, both a major exporter. So what happens in Ukraine will have an impact globally. Longer term, if we don't change our broken agricultural system, is that we will, and we already are, experiencing decreases in harvests as a result of decreasing soil fertility, increasing fragility of the production. So the resilience is what we're losing, and that will have long-term consequences, not just in Ukraine, but of course everywhere else as well.
So it would be a big mistake to think that the global food crisis is only due to the geopolitical crisis.
Certainly not. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Which means that we can do a lot about it. The next sector, Andreas, I want to talk about is the built environment. As we know, reconstructing damaged buildings and infrastructure will require even more amounts of resources and produce huge amounts of greenhouse gases. So things will get even worse also in this regard. What's a better way to reconstruct the country?
Housing in Ukraine has been the one that's most hit in terms of the destruction that has been made. Huge amounts of waste. You can see it on the pictures that are unfortunately in the news every day. But then, of course, to rebuild, you need to, it's more resources. So there's going to be, in any case, a huge amount of resources and material that you need to build. I guess the opportunity, despite that, is though that when we rebuild, that we rebuild back better, that we use circular economy approaches from the beginning to ensure that the materials are as sustainable as possible, that they can be also recaptured and they can be reused at their end of the life, unlike the current situation where I'm sure most of it is going to landfills. Those are all resources that should be recycled, reused, and that needs planning from the beginning. And we have that.
Absolutely.
Those approaches.
The whole Ukraine case is such a good case to understand what we are doing wrong.
Exactly.
In an extreme way. And it should teach people about the waste from construction and that we have to think about it because there are solutions. Technically, this is not at all a problem to have a circular economy
Indeed.
in the built environment.
Indeed. Also, in terms of energy, of course, if you rebuild buildings, that you ensure that they are energy efficient, that you ensure that the houses are zero emission buildings in line with EU standards. There's the Energy Performance in Buildings Directive in the European Union, which requires already now that we have near zero emissions buildings. So we already have that happening in terms of requirements. And so when reconstruction happens, it needs to go in that direction. We can also, go beyond that, make sure that when we plan buildings, neighborhoods, even cities, Mariupol, that it is done in such a way as to optimize the transportation in order to be able to avoid pollution, to enhance quality of life.
Let's continue with another important sector, the heavy industry. This legacy is hard to overcome, I assume.
The heavy industry is especially concentrated, for better and for worse, in the eastern part of the country and in the southern part of the country. And unfortunately, that is being pummeled by the ongoing fighting. So a lot of it is being destroyed. So there is a kind of a shift happening, like it or not, in the Ukrainian economy simply as a result of that. And in terms of reconstruction, there'll be new opportunities in terms of reconstructing some of those industries. I'm sure not all of them will be coming back, but some. And there is, of course, huge opportunities for improving the efficiency of resource use, the efficiency of energy. Ukraine right now is about 2 times as energy intensive as most Western European countries.
All right. So if we help Ukraine, this will have a big impact on the atmosphere as a whole.
Certainly, yeah. So it's in our interests. It's in the interest of all of us that Ukraine, for lots of reasons, and not least the environment, not least the climate, that we ensure that Ukraine is rebuilt better.
I don't hear that a lot on the media as an argument to help Ukraine. Why is that so?
We are just beginning to speak about reconstruction. There's some of us that are quite intensively discussing that, but I think at this point it's a relatively small circle.
We still need to talk about forestry. As you mentioned, it's important for the Ukraine economy. Forests are critical, of course, as we know, to mitigate climate change. And at the same time, timber is one of the key industry sectors. What do you do about that dilemma?
It's a continuation, essentially, of what we were doing before the war, what we were calling for before the war, which is a mixture of protecting the most valuable areas, forest areas. So these are areas, old growth forests, for example, but then at the same time ensuring that other areas are sustainably managed. The other thing is with the forests, a problem that you have in Ukraine, but also in other countries, is the region is that there's relatively little added value given to the forest. And I think that's where we come back to the concept of circular economy, ensuring that we take the wood, that we make good use of it, for example, for housing, for furniture, or whatever, but then construct it and design or plan it in such a way that we can recapture that resource and then reuse it and get more value out of it. So it's a cascading use of that wood all the way down to maybe at the end paper and pulp, and then finally energy. That requires a redesign of the system to a certain extent to be able to recapture that. But it's all about making better use of the resources that we have.
I totally agree, of course, but you need skills in the country, talent, people who know how to do that.
Yeah. So in the report that we put together with BCG, that's one of the things we emphasize, the need for development of capacity, of know-how, of education, entrepreneurship, innovation. That is a critical piece of the whole puzzle. Another part, though, I think is, and that's where we come in the picture, and Western companies perhaps working together with Ukrainians and transferring those skills to the extent that the innovations exist somewhere else. That's one thing. At the same time, I've been amazed at the resourcefulness and the innovation that I've seen in Ukraine already before the war, but especially during the war. The IT branch, which is doing quite well despite the war, that resourcefulness that you see within Ukraine right now, those are exactly the kinds of qualities that will be needed also to create a circular economy related to forests or the built environment.
There are a lot of Ukrainians right now here in the western part of Europe. Can we help train them? So when they go back one day, they will reconstruct their country.
That's, I think,
sustainable way.
It is such an opportunity for transferring skills, for making connections, skills even at the level of language, or connections that provide then hope going forward. All the people that are here now, they will go back with some kind of things that they've learned. We WWF, we've been talking to the Impact Hub, this network of organizations focused on entrepreneurship and innovation. And one of the things that we're looking at is, how can we put together a program that provides these kind of basic skills on design thinking, entrepreneurship, and in this way, not only give those skills, but also give them a kind of a glide path back to Ukraine when the time comes, when the war is over, that they can reintegrate as quickly as possible and also be productive in rebuilding their country in a way that's better.
Sounds like a plan.
I hope.
We've talked about so many things we need to do. How much is that going to cost?
So in our report, we haven't done a detailed costing. So we don't have that ourselves. That was well beyond the scope of our undertaking. The Ukrainian government has said 750 billion euros. I think that's a good, a sense of the size is somewhere around there, probably. Yes. We should say that the 750 billion euros is over a period of 10 years, of which a good half of it is in the second half. So it's not all at once. And according to the Ukrainian government, and I think that makes sense, the expectation would be about a third of that would be expected to come in some form of grants, aid, support from governments, aid agencies. Another part would come in the form of loans from international financial institutions, for example, and then a good third of it would come from the private sector, in fact.
And let's not talk about cost, but rather investment.
Exactly.
Where's the business opportunity for corporates? Where do you see that coming up?
This is an opportunity to invest in the country, to provide innovation for decarbonization, for improved reuse of resources, resource efficiency, housing, whatever it is. There'll be a lot of services, innovation, solutions ultimately needed.
In what form of collaboration between WWF and corporates or public donors do you envision? What are you hoping for in the future?
They'll be focusing on certain industries or sectors of special interest to us. Certainly among those will be forests, agriculture, biodiversity, water. I expect, for example, on forests, it'll be similar to what we've already been doing, in fact, before the war. With IKEA, we've been working very closely in terms of identifying high conservation value forests, so areas that need to be protected within the broader certification schemes of FSC, promoting sustainable forest management. So that would be the kind of a good example of the kind of cooperation that we'd continue to expect going forward in the case of forestry. One of the major environmental problems that Ukraine has had already before the war was with water management, quantity, but especially with quality. And that goes back to partly the agriculture issues, the pesticides and the fertilizers that are destroying water courses. So that will certainly be an issue going forward, and it's already having an impact on agricultural production, for example. So, the kind of cooperation that we would have is not only looking at nature-based solutions for improving agriculture in this case, but also the dependence of also other industries on water. Every single company is dependent on water in one way or another. Obviously, beverage companies, for example, we had an initial cooperation with a brewery in Dnipro in Ukraine and did this analysis through the water risk filter. They were surprised at how dependent they were on water and how fragile it was because of the pollution that was coming from agriculture on the one hand, and at the same time they were sharing that resource together with the local municipality. So if worse came to worse and something broke down, they would have the possibility of either not having enough water for their production or not having enough water for the city. And so as a result, we started then working with them about improving the water system and looking at how to improve the management of water by the farmers. So there would be less pesticides, less fertilizers going into that. So, this kind of broader engagement, one example of, well before the war, but also will be, I think, very relevant going forward.
So a lot to do and a great vision. If you look at Germany after World War II, how Germany became a role model for democracy.
Yeah.
Ukraine could be the role model for sustainability in any case.
Exactly.
That would be wonderful.
It's a huge tragedy what is happening right now, but there is a slender, nevertheless, silver lining in the opportunity to build back better and in a way that to leap ahead in many different areas.
You and BCG published the report just recently. How were the reactions so far?
I think it's too early to say. We've had a meeting with the European Commission, welcomed the report. We had a stakeholder forum. Reaction there from the Ukrainian Ministry of Environment was, let's say, unnecessarily defensive. I hope that changes going forward. But in terms of really getting a sense of the reaction to the report, that needs to still be seen because we're just beginning to have those individual meetings with different organizations, different financiers, different governments. I should say that, in terms of the expectations report, there's only so much you could do in 60 pages. So, can't really expect to have a detailed blueprint on
Well,
that.
it's the start of an important discussion.
Exactly. And that's the way we have pitched it. We don't have all the answers, but what we are trying to say with this report is that as we go forward, as we respond to those first immediate needs, as we think further in terms of reconstruction, make sure that that is put into that broader perspective of the really civilizational challenges that are facing us in terms of climate change, also in terms of nature loss. Make sure that it's a long-term investment rather than simply reconstructing an unsustainable past.
And we will learn a lot from one another, because this is not just true for Ukraine, what you have been writing. It's
Exactly.
true for any country, any
Exactly.
economy.
Exactly. It's an extreme situation, but yes, it's relevant for everywhere.
Well, thank you so much, Andreas, for making us dream of a better world, with Ukraine being the role model. And as you know, it's difficult to say what is impossible, for the dream of yesterday is the hope of today and the reality of tomorrow. Thank you so much, and goodbye, Andreas.
Thank you. Well said.
This episode was recorded in English so that our Ukrainian listeners can learn about the ideas for green recovery. Next time, we will go back to speaking German. Believe it or not, 2022 is almost coming to an end. And this is why we will take the time for a summary of what we have learned this year. Until then, bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Planetary Business. This is an independent podcast and not funded by ads. If you want to support this podcast, give us a 5-star review on iTunes or Spotify and tell everyone you know about it.